Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming to our symposium. As our four speakers have talked about, I'm going to be the last speaker to talk about conforming yet countering, navigating gender and racial stereotypes while becoming a leader. This is a paper that I wrote with my undergraduate student and now graduate student, Jafar Romi. As people have discussed in the previous talk as well, we are going to be looking at leadership stereotypes and how it affects men and women students and South Asian, East Asian, Black, and white students as leaders. Previous research on leadership stereotypes looks at how members of different racial and gender groups conform or violate stereotypes of a leader as being competent, agentic, caring, and warm. However, few studies look at how personality assessments used in the leadership development context are biased against women and racial minorities. So here you see a brief summary of the leader prototype research, where leaders are stereotyped as warm and competent or communal and agentic. So we build on this research to look at how does these dimensions fit to different racial and ethnic minority groups in addition to different gender groups. So here you see a summary of the past research categorizing members of different racial and ethnic groups and members of different gender groups according to these dimensions. So you can see here on this slide, people use the terms competent and agentic for different leadership contexts, and those have slightly different meanings, and communal and warm. Again, those have slightly different meanings in the leadership context, and here you can also see how different racial and gender groups fall onto these dimensions. So we examined how personality characteristics typically measured with the big five dimensions are affected by racial and gender stereotypes, and also how personality dimensions affect leadership ratings. We predicted that due to the stereotype triggering nature of personality characteristics, that those also will be subject to gender and racial stereotypes. So our current study looks at about 1,000 undergraduate business students who took leadership development courses over the past 5 or 6 years. They all work in teams of 3 to 6 members and work on a team project worth 30 to 40% of their final grade, and they assess each other on personality and leadership characteristics based on their coursework. So at the end of the semester, after working with these students, they rate them on personality and leadership characteristics. And this was used as a way to teach about personality and leadership characteristics, and also to have them assess each other for their own self-development and self-awareness. We used the Big Five short form, and this again was because it was a class work. They assess each of their members on the 10 items, and as you can see here, our initial analysis showed that the reliability of the BFI was fairly low, and this is how we were prompted to do this research. We also used Stochel's Leadership Behavior Descriptive Questionnaire, which had 20 items assessing both the interpersonal and the task leadership dimensions. As you can see here, we assess the Big Five using the Ramsted and John's inventory, and I want to point out the items used to measure the different types of personality dimensions. And here you can start to see the stereotype triggering nature of these questions. So tends to be lazy, does a thorough job, is reserved, tends to find fault, gets nervous easily, is relaxed. The leadership behavior questionnaire, on the other hand, is much more stereotype neutral, and so you can see some of the questions here on task and interpersonal leadership and how students rated each other. So this member is friendly and approachable. This member lets other team members know what is expected of them. So our research questions were, how are caring, communality, and that might be overlapping with emotionality, competence, dominance, interpreted when people of different gender and racial groups are rated. Further, how are the Big Five personality characteristics assessed when members of different ethnic and racial groups are and gender groups are rated. So our hypotheses were that in the North American context, leaders of different racial and gender groups will be rated differently on personality, especially because these items are stereotype triggering. I'm going to walk through for gender and racial group differences separately. So let's start with, how will women be rated because of the stereotype that they're subjected to. So women are perceived as more emotional, and so we might expect they're rated as more neurotic. This also overlaps with their stereotype of being caring, and so that they might get rated differently than men on gets nervous easily or being relaxed and handles stress well. So here we see the personality assessments by gender. You see here that men are rated as more lazy on conscientiousness, women are rated as doing a thorough job. And as expected, on neuroticism, women are rated as getting nervous more easily, whereas men are rated as handling stress better. So how then do we expect gender stereotypes to affect leadership ratings? Previous research suggests that men are rated as better leaders than women, so we wanted to see if this is the case for our students who are working on a leadership development course. Here we see that men are rated lower on task leadership than women, again countering previous research. However, we wanted to see if whether because gender groups are rated differently on personality traits, and because people have different leadership expectations of members of different gender groups, especially on questions like caring, communality, emotionality, competence, agency, and dominance, we wanted to see which gender group benefits more versus which one is penalized more on leadership for violating versus conforming to stereotypes. Now here we see the regression analysis and a slope analysis looking at how which group benefits more versus which group is penalized more for acting stereotypically or acting counter-stereotypically. So on the left side of this panel, we see that women benefit more than men for acting counter-stereotypically. So by not getting nervous easily, they are rated higher. However, men are penalized more than women for being lazy. Further, men benefit more than women for being relaxed. So, to summarize then, although in our study men are rated lower on task leadership than women, counter to previous studies, we see that they are also penalized more than women for being lazy. That's when they counter stereotype. However, men benefit more than women from being relaxed, but being conforming to stereotypes, whereas women benefit more than men for countering the stereotype of not getting nervous easily. So Now that we looked at how men and women are affected by conforming versus countering stereotypes, we look at the same question for how different racial and ethnic groups benefit versus are penalized for conforming versus countering stereotypes. Previous research on personality suggests that East Asians are rated as less extroverted. So you can look at some research that looks at how they're rated on the shy aspect of leadership versus being reserved. Whereas South Asians are rated as more disagreeable or tending to find fault with others, and they are rated as more dominant in the leadership context. So in our research, we find that East Asians are rated highest on reserve. However, there's no ethnic difference on the other question of the BFI, which taps into extroversion, which is being outgoing and sociable. So we here see the stereotype triggering nature of the question reserved. Similarly, we also look at how South Asians are rated, and previous research suggests that South Asians will be rated higher than East Asians on leadership, and also that the gendered nature of the racial stereotype suggests that women who are perceived, that East Asians are perceived as feminine in the North American context. So we expect them to be rated similarly to women. So here we see, as we expected, that South Asians are rated higher on interpersonal leadership. Again, we can ask the questions, because different racial groups are rated differently on personality traits, and because people have different expectations of members of different racial groups on these leadership characteristics, we can look at which racial group benefits more versus is penalized more on leadership for violating versus conforming to racial stereotypes. So here we see, using a regression analysis, the impact of increasing ratings of being reserved on leadership ratings. So here you see that East Asians are penalized somewhat, but South Asians are penalized more for being reserved. They get lower ratings on interpersonal leadership for being reserved. Note that East Asians are penalized less, and they were rated much higher on reservedness. Similarly, you can see that different ethnic groups are rated differently on personality dimensions, especially on the questions that are triggering stereotypes. So here we see that South Asians are rated highest on doing a thorough job, whereas East Asians are rated highest on finding fault with others. Note also that finding fault with others is part of dominant stereotype on the leadership stereotype content model, and doing a thorough job is part of being competent according to the leadership prototype model. So we wanted to see who benefits more versus who is penalized more for being acting or counteracting stereotypes. So here we see, when we do a regression analysis, that East Asians benefit more, but South Asians are penalized much more for being dominant on task leadership. So to summarize then, who benefits when for conforming versus countering racial stereotypes? South Asians are rated highest on doing a thorough job, again conforming to stereotypes. But East Asians benefit from being reserved, whereas by conforming to stereotypes. Whereas East Asians benefit more than South Asians for countering the stereotype of being dominant. So to summarize, the big picture of all our findings is that both gender and racial stereotypes bias judgments of leadership and personality characteristics. The underlying trait used to infer leadership are judged and weighted differently for different racial and gender groups. And we think that the stereotype content approach is useful to evaluate these measures and for detecting racial and gender biases in leadership and personality measures. Thank you for coming to our symposium, and now we're going to be doing the discussion questions and Q&A with the audience.